The wind carried the faint smell of smoke through the dry canyon, mingling with the whisper of juniper and sage. The year was 1879, and the land stretched wide and untamed, where the red earth swallowed footprints and the sun beat mercilessly upon those who dared to walk it. Dust rose with every step of the small caravan that had been making its slow way across the barren country, their wagons creaking beneath the weight of supplies, dreams, and the fragile hopes of settlers who believed they could carve a life out of the wilderness. Yet even before the mountains of Arizona had been fully settled, the land belonged to others, people who had walked it for centuries, whose laws were older than any paper signed in a government office. It was into this land, harsh and beautiful, that she found herself trapped. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes still carried a glint of fire. She had not been raised for the wild. She had been raised in a village where church bells tolled on Sundays, where men tipped their hats and women nodded politely from porches shaded by climbing vines. But here, in this unforgiving desert, none of that mattered. Survival belonged to those who understood the earth, and she was no longer among her own kind. The Apache warrior stood before her, his figure strong against the crimson cliffs that glowed in the dying light of evening. His chest was bare, his skin bronzed by sun and battle, and his hair fell in long dark strands that caught in the wind. In his eyes there burned something that both frightened and unsettled her, something she could not name. He was not cruel, yet he was not gentle either. His presence carried the weight of a man bound by something greater than himself, a law etched not by ink but by blood, fire, and tradition. "You must marry me," he said, his voice low, steady, and heavy with certainty. His words hung between them, sharp as the cry of a hawk above the canyon rim. Tribal law commands it. Her breath caught, and for a moment she could not speak. The land around her seemed to hold its breath as well. The wind stilled.
Oh.
The horses tied nearby shifted nervously, and even the canyon itself seemed to listen. She could not move her gaze from his. Marriage, the word clashed against everything she had ever known. Marriage was something chosen, blessed by Scripture, celebrated with ribbons and flowers, not demanded at the edge of the wilderness by a man whose world was so far from her own. She wanted to protest, to tell him it was impossible, that she belonged to another life. Yet when she tried to summon the words, her voice faltered. Something in his tone, something fierce, unyielding, yet strangely vulnerable, silenced her. This was not the first time she had seen him. For days he had shadowed the wagons, watching from the ridges. Some of the settlers had whispered warnings, saying the Apache were dangerous, quick to strike, and merciless. But when the attack finally came, it had not been death that met hurt, had been him. He had taken her from the chaos, away from the cries and flames, carrying her across the desert as if her weight were nothing. She had fought him then, striking against him with fists and words, but he had not harmed her. He had brought her here to his people, and now stood before her making a claim she could not comprehend. She searched his face, looking for cruelty, for mockery, for anything that would explain this demand. Instead, she found longing, fierce, unshakable longing. It was not the longing of a man who sought to conquer. It was deeper, more desperate, something tied to his very soul, as though her answer carried more than the fate of two people. "What law?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "The law of blood and honor," he replied. His jaw tightened, and he took a slow breath, as though steadying himself. "You saved my sister when the river rose. You pulled her from the water when no one else could reach her. By our law, by the bond that act has made, I am bound to you. I cannot turn from it. To deny it is to bring dishonor upon my family, upon my people. And you," his voice broke for the first time, just barely, yet enough to reveal that his words were not spoken lightly. "You are bound to me." Her mind reeled. She remembered the girl, the flash of panic as the current had dragged her under, the desperate grasp of small hands reaching toward her. It had been instinct. Nothing. Morsha had not thought of law or consequence, only of saving a life. Now, standing in this place where the world felt carved from stone and fate itself, she realized that single act had written a story she never asked for. "I cannot," she whispered. Though even as she said it, her voice wavered. I do not belong here. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth of his skin, could see the faint scar along his temple, the lines carved by hardship and battle. His presence wrapped around her like the desert heat, suffocating and irresistible. You belong where fate places you, he said, his words steady now, heavy with conviction. And fate has placed you here. Her heart pounded, torn between fear and something she refused to name. This was madness. It was impossible. And yet, standing beneath the endless desert sky, she could not deny the truth in his eyes. They burned with something that was not only duty, not only law, but a yearning that threatened to undo her resolve. She wanted to turn away, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls rose high, the desert stretched endless, and he stood before her like a wall of flesh and spirit she could not move past. Her lips parted, ready to speak, to defy, to beg, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, silence bound them. Silence, and the echo of his demand. You must marry me. And as the sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the sky in fire and blood, she realized that the life she had always known was slipping further and further away, replaced by a destiny she had never imagined. A destiny that was not yet written, but already carved into the heart of the man before her. Her fingers trembled at her sides, her pulse raced in her ears. The desert seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting, pressing down with the weight of an answer she could not yet give. The law of his people stood unbroken. His longing burned in the shadows between them, and her next breath would decide whether she defied them all or surrendered to the fire in his eyes. The choice lingered, trembling in the silence as the night closed in. The night spread its silence across the canyon, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the restless crackle of the fire. She sat near the flames, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, while the Apache warrior lingered in the shadows, watching her with eyes that revealed little of what he thought. The words he had spoken still pressed against her heart, heavy and unrelenting. You must marry me. The weight of it refused to leave her, echoing like the steady beat of a drum in her chest. She tried to think of home, of the simple street where children played until sundown, of the sound of her father's hammer striking iron at the forge, of the soft voice of her mother humming in the evenings. Those images seemed so far away now, fading with each hour she spent in this wilderness. Out here the world felt larger, older, and far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. The Apache people moved with a certainty she did not understand. They walked through the land as if it were alive and listening, as if every stone and tree knew their steps. Their camp was not like the villages she had known. It was quiet, built not with timber and stone, but with hides and brush, blending into the desert as though it had grown from the ground itself. Men sharpened spears by firelight, women tended to children and cooked food over flames, and the young ones watched her with wide, curious eyes. She was an outsider. Every glance reminded her of that. Some looked at her with suspicion, some with pity, and some with an unreadable expression she dared not interpret. Yet none looked at her as he did the one who claimed her with words she could not escape. His gaze never wavered, carrying both strength and a hidden longing she wished she could ignore. In the days that followed, she'd learned more than she wanted. She learned that the man who demanded her hand was no ordinary warrior. He was the son of a respected elder, a man whose word carried weight among his people. His life was tied to tradition, bound by the customs that shaped their every choice. His sister, the girl she had saved from the rushing river, was cherished, and that act of rescue had set into motion a law she could not bend or break. He did not explain much, but the whispers around the camp told her enough. The Apache believed that when one life was spared in such a way, it created a bond stronger than kinship. To save a life was to bind it to your own, and that bond could only be honored through marriage. To deny it was to dishonor not only the family, but the tribe itself. At night, when the stars burned bright and countless above the desert, she lay awake listening to the coyotes cry. Fear clung to her, yet curiosity grew alongside it. Who was he beyond the fierce commands and unyielding eyes? What did he see in her that made his voice soften, even when his words were iron? She did not understand, but she wanted to. Against her will, she wanted to. The days turned into a blur of heat, dust, and quiet tension. Sometimes she tried to speak with him, to ask what her future held if she refused. But his answers were always the same, steady, unwavering, certain. "The law binds us," he would say. "There is no other way." And each time, she felt the walls closing tighter around her. Still, she began to see fragments of the man behind the law. She saw the way he guided the younger boys, teaching them to track the prints of deer across the sand. She saw how he spoke gently to his sister, who laughed with bright eyes that lit the camp. She noticed how he stood apart from the others when disputes arose. His voice calm, yet firm enough to quiet even the loudest argument. There was strength in him. But there was also restraint to balance, she could not deny. The desert itself seemed to weave their story together. One evening, he led her beyond the camp, up a narrow trail that wound between jagged cliffs. At first, she resisted, fearing where he might take her, but his calm assurance kept her from fleeing. When they reached the top, the world opened before her. The valley stretched wide, painted gold by the sinking sun. She had never seen such beauty, such vastness. "This is our home," he said quietly, standing beside her. "Every stone, every river, every star above is who we are. Without it, we are nothing. With it, we are everything." For a moment, she forgot the weight of his demand. For a moment, she saw the land as he did, endless and alive, filled with a spirit she had never known in the wooden houses and narrow streets of her village. But the spell broke when he turned to her, his voice low and certain once more. "And now, you are part of it." She wanted to deny him, to cry out that she could not belong here, that her heart still ached for home. But the words caught in her throat, as they always did. Trapped beneath the strange pull she felt when his eyes lingered on her, whispers grew around the camp as the days stretched on. Some wondered if she would refuse, if she would break the law that bound them. Others said it was impossible, that fate had already chosen. She felt the weight of their eyes wherever she went, pressing her toward a choice she was not ready to make. But she also began to feel the stirrings of another truth, when she did not want to admit. Each time his hand brushed hers, each time his voice lowered to a murmur meant only for her, something within her stirred. It frightened her more than the law, more than the tribe. It's more than the canyon walls that trapped her in this place. One night, as the fire burned low and the camp quieted, she found herself unable to sleep. Rising, she stepped into the shadows, her eyes searching the cliffs above. She needed air, space, anything to silence the storm inside her. But before she could take more than a few steps, he was there, as if he had been waiting. "You cannot run," he said softly. His words were not harsh this time, but certain all the same. "I wasn't," she whispered back, though even to her own ears it sounded like a lie. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped closer, his presence filling the night around her. "I will not force you," he said, surprising her with the gentleness of his tone. "But the law cannot be broken. Not without cost." "What cost?" she asked, her voice trembling. His silence was answer enough. The shadows in his eyes spoke louder than words. She realized then that whatever fate bound them, it reached further than the two of them. The tribe watched, the law waited. And the desert itself seemed to hold its breath for her answer. Her heart pounded. Torn between the life she had lost and the life that now demanded her. She wanted to ask him if he felt the same fear she did, if the fierce longing in his eyes was born of duty alone or something deeper. But the words never left her lips. The night swallowed them whole. And the tension between them grew heavier than the desert air. She knew that soon, far sooner than she wanted, the choice would come. And when it did, it would change not only her fate, but the fate of everyone watching, waiting, believing in a law older than either of them. And as the fire crackled in the distance and the stars wheeled endlessly overhead, she realized that the true danger was not the law itself, but the way her heart began to tremble each time he looked at her, as though it already knew what her lips could not yet speak. The days that followed carried with them a strange rhythm. She began to recognize the patterns of life among the Apache, the way the women rose before dawn to grind corn, the way the hunters returned with quiet pride after a long day, the way the children laughed, even in the harshest heat. It was not the world she had known, yet it was a world bound tightly together, stitched by loyalty, tradition, and the invisible thread of law. Still, she could not shake the weight of the command that hung between her and the warrior who had spoken it. His presence lingered everywhere. In the mornings, when the first light spread across the canyon and painted the cliffs gold, she would find him near the horses, his movements sure and precise. At midday, when the sun burned fiercely, she would see him teaching the younger boys to notch arrows and read the shifting tracks in the sand. And at night, when the fire glowed red against the dark, she felt his gaze on her, steady and unrelenting. It was as if the law that bound them had wrapped itself around every part of her day, closing off the life she had once believed she would return to, yet beneath the certainty of his command. She began to sense something more complicated. He carried his own burden, though he never spoke of it. There was a heaviness in his silence, a shadow in his eyes, when he thought she wasn't watching. She wondered if the law bound him as tightly as it bound her. Duty warred within him against desires he had never chosen. The tribe spoke of him often. Some called him a man of honor, one who placed the needs of his people above his own. Others whispered that he was stubborn, too bound to traditions that weighed like iron. She listened to it all, piecing together fragments of his life, but never enough to form the whole picture. And always, in those whispers, her name lingered to Anne, outsider tangled in a law she had never known. She tried to keep her distance, but fate had other plans. One afternoon, as the sun sank low and shadows lengthened across the canyon floor, a small group of men returned from the hunt with a deer slung across their shoulders. The tribe gathered to share in the success, voices lifting in praise. She stood at the edge, watching, when suddenly one of the younger hunters stepped forward, his voice sharp as he pointed toward her. "Why should she remain here?" he demanded. His words carried across the camp, silencing the laughter. "She is not one of us. She does not belong." Her breath caught as all eyes turned to her. The young man's gaze burned with suspicion, and in it she saw not only distrust but fear, the fear of change, of a bond that threatened to shift the delicate balance of tradition. Before she could speak, the warrior stepped forward. His voice was calm, but his stance left no room for challenge. "The law binds her," he said. "Her place is here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some in agreement, others in doubt. The young hunter's jaw tightened. And if she refuses? The question hung heavy in the air. The silence that followed was more telling than any answer. She felt the weight of the moment, the danger that simmered beneath the surface. The law was clear, but her heart was not. If she chose to deny it, the consequences would not fall only on her shoulders. They would ripple through the tribe, through him, through everyone watching. That night, she lay awake long after the camp had gone quiet. The fire burned low, casting shadows across the ground, and the voices of the day replayed in her mind. What if she refuses? The thought gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. What would happen if she could not surrender to a fate she had never asked for? Her heart was torn, not only by fear, but by something deeper. For in the stillness of the night she could not deny the strange bond growing between them. Each time he defended her, each time his eyes softened, despite his fierce words, she felt it pull tighter. And yet, the part of her that clung to the memory of home fought just as fiercely. Refusing to yield, the conflict within her grew heavier when whispers reached her of unrest beyond the canyon. Other settlers, other wagons, had not been spared as she had been. Bands of raiders clashed with soldiers, and blood stained the land that stretched between villages and tribal grounds. Each side spoke of justice. Each side claimed the land as their own, and in the middle, lives were torn apart. She realized then that her presence among the Apache was more dangerous than she had thought. She was not only a woman caught by tradition, she was also a symbol, one that others might see as betrayal. If word spread, would her own people turn against her? Would they see her as lost, as one who had chosen the side of those they called enemies? The thought chilled her more than the desert night. But the tribe itself was not without its divisions. She noticed it in the glances, in the hushed arguments near the fires, in the way some warriors spoke with bitterness about the encroaching settlers. For some, the law that bound her to their warrior was a sacred promise. For others, it was a thread a tether that drew danger closer. One evening, she overheard two elders speaking in low voices near the fire. "It cannot stand," one said. "To bring her into our circle is to invite trouble. Her people will come searching. Blood will follow." "The law is the law," the other replied. "It has kept us strong when the world around us changes. If we break it now, we lose more than tradition, we lose ourselves." She slipped away before they noticed her, but the words followed her into her dreams. Every path seemed shadowed, every choice sharpened to a blade, and still the warrior remained steady. His words never changed, though his eyes sometimes betrayed the storm he kept hidden. One night, as they stood near the canyon's edge, he finally spoke of the burden she had sensed all along. "I did not choose this law," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, "but I will not break it. My people look to me. If I bend, they bend. And then we are nothing." She searched his face, wondering if duty was all that held him or if something else flickered beneath the surface. But before she could ask, he turned to her, his voice low. "Do you understand what is at stake?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, but the truth was she did not. She understood pieces, fragments of a life far greater than her own, but the full weight remained just out of reach. The conflict deepened as days stretched into weeks. She grew closer to his sister, the girl she had saved, whose laughter softened the hardness of the camp. She learned to grind corn beside the women, to braid her hair in their style, to move quietly across the sand without leaving a trace. And with each new skill, each new bond, she felt herself pulled further into their world. Yet her heart remained divided, torn between the home she had lost and the fate pressing closer with each sunrise. One afternoon, while gathering water at the stream, she heard the sound of hooves in the distance. Riders approached men from outside, settlers armed and weary. They did not see her hidden among the brush, but their voices carried. "The Apache took her," one said bitterly. "If she's still alive, she's as good as lost." Her breath caught. They were searching. Her people had not forgotten, but their words carried no hope of rescue, only anger, only talk of revenge. She returned to camp shaken, the knowledge heavy in her chest. If they came here, if they found her, blood would spill. She was no longer only bound by laws, she was bound by the sharp edge of two worlds that would never meet. That night, as the fire burned and shadows danced along the canyon walls, the warrior spoke again. His eyes held hers, fierce yet uncertain, and his voice carried the weight of the storm gathering around them. "You must decide soon," he said. "The law cannot wait forever." Her heart pounded as silence stretched between them. Around them, the tribe carried on, unaware of the settlers gathering beyond the canyon, unaware of the storm she carried within. The desert felt smaller now, the stars pressing closer, the cliffs echoing with the tension of a choice that would change everything. She knew the time was coming, when she could no longer stand between two worlds, but whichever path she chose, it would carry a cost greater than she could bear. And as the firelight flickered in his eyes, she realized the true conflict was no longer only about the law. It was about the fragile thread binding them together. A thread that might either save them more, break them both. The days grew shorter, and the desert nights colder. A restless unease settled over the camp, as though even the land itself sensed the storm drawing near. Whispers traveled quickly, carried from fire to fire, tent to tent of riders seen on the horizon. Settlers, armed and determined. Their voices carried anger, and their numbers were growing. The people feared what was coming, though they hid it beneath straight backs and steady words. But she could feel it in every glance, every hurried movement. Every silence that stretched too long, the warrior stood taller than ever, his shoulders squared as if braced against the wind. Yet she saw what the others did not, the tension in his jaw, the way his hand lingered too long on the hilt of his knife, the heaviness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He bore the weight of his people, the law, and the bond that tied them together. And though he never spoke of it, she knew he feared what was to come. She could not escape the conflict inside her. The settlers were her people, flesh of her flesh, bound by blood and memory. But the tribe had become something she could not deny. She had shared their food, their laughter, their silence. She had seen the way they honored the land, the way they held each other close in the face of hardship. And then there was him, the man who bound her to a fate she had never imagined, yet whose presence had become impossible to ignore. Each day the tension grew sharper, and each night the silence between them deepened. He would not force her, yet his words never wavered. "You must marry me." It was not a question, but a command wrapped in longing, in fear, in duty. And with each passing hour, her choice felt less like her own and more like a fire building toward an inevitable blaze. One evening, the elders gathered the tribe by the central fire. The flames cracked and hissed, their sparks rising into the vast desert sky. She stood at the edge, her heart pounding as the oldest among them spoke. His voice was steady, but his eyes searched the shadows beyond the camp. "The settlers come closer," he said. "They search for what they believe is theirs. They will not stop. We must be ready." Murmurs rose through the crowd. Some called for strength, for battle. Others urged for caution, for finding another place to hide. But all voices eventually turned toward her. The outsider at the heart of their turmoil, it is her presence that draws them, one man said bitterly. "If she leaves, they may not come." Another shook his head. "The law binds her. To cast her out is to break what we cannot break." The fire's glow painted their faces in shades of gold and shadow, and she felt every word like a stone pressed against her chest. Her throat tightened, but before she could speak, the warrior stepped forward. His voice cut through the crowd, low and firm. "She stays," he said. "The law commands it, and I will protect her." His words silenced them, though unease still rippled beneath their silence. She looked at him then, and for the first time, she saw not only the warrior, but the man once standing at the edge of losing everything. His promise was not only to his people, but to her, and the thought filled her with both fear and something far more dangerous. That night, she could not sleep. She walked beyond the fire's reach, the desert stretching wide and endless beneath the stars. The cold air stung her skin, but her thoughts burned hotter than any flame. She remembered the settlers' voices by the stream, bitter and sharp, and she knew the time was near when both worlds would collide. He found her there, standing alone in the moonlight. His footsteps were silent, but she felt his presence before she turned. "You are afraid," he said softly. Her breath caught. "And you are not?" His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. "I have no room for fear. My people need strength, but Yesai feel it. Fear of what will come, fear of what may be lost. Fear of you," she frowned, confused. "Fear of me?" He stepped closer, the silver light carving shadows along his face. "Because you carry my fate in your hands. Whether you stay or leave, whether you honor the bond or break it everything, I am rests on your choice." The weight of his words struck her harder than any command. For the first time she realized he was not only a man of law, not only a voice of tradition. He was bound to, caught as tightly as she was in the web of fate. Her lips parted, but the words never came. Instead, silence wrapped around them, thick and unyielding, as if the desert itself waited for her answer. The following day, the storm broke. Scouts returned with news settlers camped not far from the canyon, their numbers many, their weapons ready. The tribe prepared with quiet urgency, sharpening blades, gathering supplies, and moving children to safer ground. The air was heavy, charged with the promise of violence. She moved through the camp like a ghost, her heart pounding, her thoughts torn in two. Everywhere she turned, she saw the signs of a people bracing for survival. Mothers clutched their children closer, men spoke in hushed voices, and the young boys tried to stand taller, pretending to be braver than they felt. She wanted to scream, to run, to shake them all and tell them this wasn't her choice, that she never asked to carry this weight. But the truth was clear, whether she wanted it or not. Our presence had become the spark at the center of the fire. That evening, as the sun sank blood-red behind the cliffs, the warrior sought her out. His eyes burned with the same fierce resolve she had seen from the first moment. But now it was sharpened by the edge of battle. "Tomorrow they may come," he said. "If they do, the law will be tested. I will stand no matter the cost. But you," his voice broke, just enough for her to hear the truth beneath the steel, "you must decide before the dawn. For when they arrive, there will be no turning back." Her heart thundered. The desert stretched wide around them, silent and vast, as if holding its breath. She wanted to tell him she couldn't choose, that she was torn apart, that she didn't know which world was hers anymore. But his eyes held hers, and she knew he would not accept hesitation. The night was endless. She lay awake, listening to the cries of coyotes in the distance, the shifting of horses, the low murmur of guards keeping watch. Every sound pressed against her chest, reminding her of the choice that waited with the dawn. She thought of her village, of the faces she once knew, of the family who might believe her lost forever. She thought of the tribe who had welcomed her into their circle even with suspicion, who had shared their food and fire. And she thought of him, the man who carried the law like a shield, yet whose eyes betrayed a longing that was far more fragile than tradition. When the first light touched the horizon, painting the canyon in shades of gold and fire, she rose. The camp was already stirring, the air alive with tension. Warriors moved with purpose. Children were ushered to safety, and the women whispered prayers to the rising sun. He stood at the edge of the camp, his figure carved against the light. She approached slowly, her hands trembling, her heart caught between fear and resolve. He turned as she neared, his gaze searching her face, as though he could read the answer there before she spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. The choice hung between them, waiting, pressing, demanding. And beyond the cliffs, the sound of distant hooves began to rise. Thundering closer with each heartbeat, she opened her mouth, the words trembling on her lips, but before they could escape, the first echo of gunfire cracked through the morning air. The sound tore across the canyon, shattering the silence, sending birds scattering into the sky. The storm had arrived. The camp erupted into chaos, voices shouting, children crying, warriors rushing to their posts. The settlers were here. And in that moment, caught between the law of his people and the blood of her own, she realized the true climax was no longer about choice. It was about survival. He seized her arm, pulling her close, his eyes burning with fierce determination. "Stay with me," he commanded. "No matter what happens, stay with me." Her breath caught, her pulse raced, and the thunder of hooves drew nearer, louder, shaking the very earth beneath them. The world was about to shatter, and she stood at its center, bound by love, law, and the fire of two worlds colliding. The battle had not yet begun, but the desert already trembled with its promise. And as she clutched his hand, her heart knew that the next moments would decide everything: their fate, their bond, their very survival. The sound of hooves thundered closer, each beat shaking the ground beneath her feet. Gunfire cracked again, echoing against the canyon walls, followed by the sharp cries of men preparing to fight. Dust rose on the horizon, thick and choking, as settlers surged toward the camp. Panic swept through the people, children rushed to the safety of the cliffs. Women hurried them along, and warriors gripped their weapons with grim determination. She stood frozen, her heart caught in her throat, till his grip on her arm anchored her to the moment. "Stay with me," he repeated, his voice steady even as the chaos unfolded around them. His eyes locked on hers, fierce and unwavering, and she knew he meant more than the battle before them. He meant the law, the bond, the life that waited if they survived. Her chest tightened, torn between the pull of two worlds. The settlers charged into the canyon, rifles raised, their shouts carried on the wind. The clash erupted in an instant. A roast whistled through the air. Rifles cracked, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder filled her lungs. The once quiet camp became a storm of sound and fury. She crouched low, trembling, watching as the warrior moved like a shadow through the chaos. Every step sure, every strike purposeful. He fought not only for his people, but for her, his gaze flicking toward her even in the midst of battle to ensure she was safe. Fear gripped her as she saw men she once knew among the settlers, their faces twisted with rage, their voices calling out words she could barely recognize. They saw her, and in their eyes she was not a woman caught between two worlds but a traitor, someone stolen and remade into something unrecognizable. The sight pierced her heart, but the battle left no room for hesitation. A gunshot rang out close by, and she ducked instinctively. When she lifted her gaze, she saw him stumble, a red line across his arm. Her breath caught, but he did not falter. He pressed on, his jaw tight, his movements sharper than ever. The sight of his blood, his refusal to yield, struck something deep within her. She realized then that whatever bound them was not only was choice. Not the choice spoken aloud, but the choice made in the heart. She scrambled toward the supply tents, pulling cloth to press against his wound when he returned to her side. Her hands trembled as she tied it tightly, the sounds of battle roaring around them. His eyes met hers for the briefest moment, and in them she saw both pain and something more powerful, trust. The clash stretched on, long and brutal. The settlers pushed forward, but the canyon was not theirs, and the Apache knew every path, every shadow. The warriors fought with the land itself, striking and vanishing, turning the narrow walls into their shield. By midday, the settlers' cries began to waver, their formation broken, their strength fading beneath the unyielding defense. One by one, they fell back, retreating into the dust and silence of the desert. When it was over, the camp was left scarred but unbroken. Smoke lingered in the air, and the cries of the wounded filled the canyon, but the people stood tall. The settlers were gone, driven back by the very ground they sought to claim. She stood amid the ruin, her heart pounding, tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks. He approached her slowly, his arms still bound, his face shadowed with exhaustion. Yet his eyes carried the same steady fire, unbroken even by the weight of battle. For a long moment they said nothing. The silence held everything, the fear, the loss, the bond that had been tested in fire and blood. Finally, he spoke. Now you see, the law is not only words, it is survival. It is honor. It is what holds us when the world seeks to break us. Her throat tightened as she looked at him. Then at the people around her, women, comforting children, men lifting the fallen, all of them bound together by something greater than themselves. She thought of her old life, the village where she had been born, and she realized it was gone. Even if she returned, she would never be the same. The desert had claimed her, just as it had claimed him. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his wounded arm, her voice soft but certain. Then I will honor it. Not because I must, but because I choose to. His breath caught, the fierceness in his gaze breaking into something deeper, more vulnerable. He reached for her hand, his grip strong yet careful, as though he feared she might vanish if he held too tightly. Around them, the camp slowly quieted, the people turning their eyes toward the pair at the center of the storm. Whispers spread, but this time they carried hope instead of doubt. In the days that followed, the tribe rebuilt. Fires were rekindled, wounds tended, and life began again. She worked alongside the women, grinding corn and mending garments, her hands no longer clumsy but steady, certain. The children laughed near her now, no longer fearful, and the elders watched her with new eyes, not as an outsider, but as someone bound by the same threads that bound them all. The warrior never strayed far from her side. They spoke little of what had happened, for words were not needed. In every glance, every brush of hands, every shared silence, the truth was clear. The bond between them had been forged not only by tradition, but by fire, by choice, by survival. And yet the memory of the settlers lingered. She thought of their faces, of the anger in their eyes, of the way they had called her lost. Perhaps, to them, she was. But she had found something greater in the Canyuna truth she could not deny. On the evening of the wedding, the tribe gathered once more by the central fire. The flames danced high, casting long shadows as songs rose into the night. She stood beside him, her hand in his, her heart steady, despite the weight of all that had brought her here. An elder spoke the words of the law, binding them in the eyes of the people. Yet as the firelight flickered across his face, she knew it was not law alone that tied them. It was the choice she had made, the choice to stay, to stand beside him, to embrace the life that had found her in the heart of the desert. When the ceremony ended, the people raised their voices in celebration, drums echoing into the night. She looked at him, her chest full, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I am not afraid anymore." He pressed his forehead to hers, his words a vow carried softly between them. "And you will never be alone." The desert stretched endless around them, vast and unyielding, yet no longer empty. She had come to it as a captive, caught by fate, torn between two worlds. But she remained by choice, bound not only by tradition, but by love, by survival, by the unbreakable bond of two souls finding each other against all odds. As the fire burned into the night and the stars wheeled above, she understood at last what the law truly meant. It was not chains nor command, but a thread that held a people together, that bound life to life, heart to heart. And in that truth she found not only survival but belonging. The canyon would forever hold their story. Etched into the stone, whispered by the wind, remembered in the songs of those who came after. She had walked into it a stranger, but she would remain as part of it. Bound to him, bound to the desert, bound to a law that had become not a prison, but a promise. And so, in the heart of the wild land, where fire and blood had tested them, they stood together, no longer divided, no longer afraid. The law had commanded, the heart had chosen, and the two had become one. The echo of the gunfire slowly faded into silence, leaving only the cries of the wounded and the heavy breathing of those who had survived. The dust settled over the canyon floor, and the smoke drifted upward into the wide desert sky. She stood still, her hands trembling. The warrior's grip steady on her arm as though to remind her that she was still there, still breathing. The settlers had been driven back, but not without cost. The camp bore the scars of the fight-torn shelters. Broken arrows scattered across the ground, and the quiet grief of those who had lost someone dear. She walked among them, helping where she could. Her skirts were smeared with dust and blood as she carried water, pressed cloth to wounds, and soothed frightened children. Each face she touched was another thread binding her to the people, another piece of her old life slipping further into memory. She no longer felt like an outsider, though whispers still followed her. The law had bound her to him, but the battle had bound her to all of them. She understood now that survival in the desert was not about walls of stone or doors with locks. It was about loyalty. It's about standing together when the world pressed hardest against you. The warrior did not leave her side. His arm was still bound from his wound, though he brushed it off whenever she worried. His eyes, however, betrayed the pain he carried, not only from the battle, but from the weight of the choices that had yet to be spoken. At night, when the camp grew quiet, they sat together near the fire. She wanted to ask him what came next, if peace was possible, if the settlers would return, but he did not speak of the future. His words remained few, his gaze turned off into the stars, as though searching for answers written across the sky. One evening, his sister sat beside her. The girl's laughter, which had once been bright and unshaken, was softer now, touched by the memory of loss. Yet her eyes shone with a kind of trust that made her heart ache. "You saved me from the river," the girl said, her voice gentle, "and now you have saved us again. My brother was right. You were meant to be here." She did not know how to answer. She thought of the village she had left behind, of the faces that might still be searching for her. Perhaps to them she was lost as good as gone. But here in the canyon she had found something she had not expected. She had found belonging, though it had come wrapped in fear and fire. The elders met again after the battle, their voices low but firm. Some argued that the settlers would return in greater numbers, that they must leave and find safety elsewhere. Others insisted they stay, that abandoning their home would be a betrayal to their ancestors. The argument stretched into the night, but one truth remained clear. She was no longer only a question among them. She was part of the answer. It was the oldest among the elders who finally spoke with finality. The law has spoken. She is bound here as we are bound here. To tear her away now would weaken us all. The words settled over the fire like a blessing. For the first time, she felt the eyes of the tribe on her, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. The days passed, and slowly the camp returned to life. Wounds healed, shelters were rebuilt, and laughter returned, though softer, more fragile than before. She rose with the women at dawn, grinding corn, carrying water, weaving what had been torn. Her hands grew calloused, her movements steady, till even she could no longer remember the clumsy stranger who had first stumbled into their midst. Yet the memory of the battle remained. Sometimes in the quiet hours, she thought of the settlers she had seen among the dustmen she might once have passed on the road in her old village. Would they return for her? Would they see her now as someone who had betrayed them? Would they see the truth, that she had been given no choice, but had found one anyway? The questions gnawed at her, but each time she looked into his eyes, the answers mattered less. One night, when the moon hung low and silver over the canyon, he spoke what had long remained unspoken. "You chose to stay," he said, his voice low but certain. "Not only because of the law," she nodded, her throat tight. "Because of you." "Because of all of this?" She gestured to the camp, to the fire, to the people who had become her family. "I cannot turn away now. My place is here." For the first time since she had met him, his face softened into something unguarded, something almost tender. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady, and in that moment, she understood that his longing had never been about command. It had been about hope. The wedding came with little ceremony, yet with weight greater than any church bells could carry. The tribe gathered by the fire, their voices lifted in song, the drums echoing into the night. She stood beside him, her hand in his, the flames painting their faces in gold. The elders spoke the words of the law, binding them not just in tradition, but in the hearts of all who watched. When it was done, the people cheered, their voices carrying into the desert. And for the first time, she felt no fear, only peace, as the celebration stretched into the night. She looked at him and whispered, "It feels different now. Not as if I am bound, but as if I am free." He smiled, the rare expression softening his strong features. That is what the law truly means. Not chains, but threads that hold us together when the world tries to tear us apart. In the days that followed, the thread of the settlers lingered, but it no longer weighed as heavily on her heart. She knew they might return, that conflict might rise again, but she also knew she would not face it alone. She was no longer the girl taken from a wagon in the desert. She was no longer torn between two worlds. She was part of this one now, bound by choice as much as by law. Her story had begun with fear, with loss, with a command that felt like a prison, but it ended with understanding, with love, with a truth she would carry for the rest of her days, that survival is not about walls or weapons, about trust, loyalty, and the courage to embrace what fate sets before you. The canyon would forever bear the marks of the battle, but it would also bear the memory of the bond forged there. Her name would be spoken not as a stranger, but as part of their story, woven into the songs that rose with the drums each night, and as the desert stretched endless around them, vast and unyielding, she knew she had found what she had never expected: a home, a people, and a love that had been waiting for her all along. The fire crackled. The stars burned bright above, and the wind carried whispers through the cliffs. Whispers of survival, of law, of love stronger than fear. And with her hand in his, she felt not the weight of chains, but the strength of belonging. The kind that even time could not undo. The story of her capture had become the story of her choice. The story of the law had become the story of her heart, and in that truth she found peace. The desert night closed around them, vast and eternal, but she no longer felt lost within it. She had become part of it, part of him, part of the people who had once seemed so far from her world. And as the fire burned low, she knew the journey was complete. Not as a captive, not as a stranger, but as one who had found her place at last, in the heart of the canyon, where law and love had become one.